Hello, and welcome back to Sleepy Scrolls. I'm here with you on this quiet evening, and I hope you found a comfortable place to settle in. Perhaps you're wrapped in a soft blanket, or maybe you're lying in bed with a gentle weight of covers pulled up to your chin. Wherever you are, take a moment to let your shoulders drop, to release any tension you might be carrying from the day. Tonight, we're going to journey back to a time when the world moved at a different pace. We'll explore the lives of knights, but not the knights of grand legends or epic battles. Instead, we'll meet the ordinary ones, the ones who struggled with their armor, who stumbled over their own feet, who found the weight of their swords almost too much to bear. These were the knights who couldn't even fight well, yet they lived, they tried, they carried on through their daily routines with quiet determination. As we begin this gentle exploration together, feel free to close your eyes and let the words wash over you like a calm stream. There's no need to remember every detail, no need to follow every thread of the story. Simply let yourself drift along with the rhythm of these old tales, these forgotten moments from centuries past. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a cozy room with rain tapping against the window? Are you in a quiet apartment where the only sound is the distant hum of the city? Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Now, let's step back in time to cobblestone courtyards and drafty castle halls, to a world where being a knight was far more complicated than the stories would have you believe. Imagine, if you will, a medieval castle courtyard on a misty morning in the year 1347. The air is thick with fog that clings to the stone walls like a soft gray blanket. You can hear the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer, rhythmic and steady, echoing off the weathered stones. The smell of wet earth mingles with the faint aroma of bread baking in the castle's kitchens, and somewhere a rooster crows lazily, as if it too is reluctant to fully wake up. In this courtyard, young men are attempting to master the art of knighthood. But this is not the glorious scene you might imagine from tales of valor and heroism. Instead, what unfolds before us is a series of small struggles, quiet failures, and the kind of mundane difficulties that rarely make it into the epic poems. There's William, barely 18 years old, who has been training for 3 years now. He stands in the center of the courtyard, wearing a suit of mail that was handed down from his older brother. The metal rings catch the weak morning light, but they also catch on each other constantly. Every time William moves, the mail pinches his skin, and the weight of it makes his shoulders ache within minutes. His instructor, Sir Edmund, a patient man with graying hair and kind eyes, watches as William attempts to mount his horse. The horse, a gentle mare named Rosalind, stands perfectly still. She's been trained for this, accustomed to the clumsy movements of young knights in training. William approaches her from the left side as he's been taught, but the weight of his armor makes each step deliberate and uncertain. He reaches for the stirrup, but the mail around his arms restricts his movement. He has to stretch, awkwardly, his metal-clad fingers fumbling for the leather loop. On his first attempt, William's foot slips. The metal of his boot scrapes against the stirrup, making a sharp sound that startles both him and the horse. Rosalind shifts slightly, just enough to throw off William's balance. He staggers backward. The weight of his armor making him move like a man walking underwater. Sir Edmund steps forward, not to criticize, but to steady the young man with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Take your time," Sir Edmund says, his voice calm and measured. "There's no rush. The horse will wait." William nods, breathing heavily, already, though he's barely moved. This is the reality that the songs don't mention, the simple, exhausting challenge of doing anything while wearing 60 pounds of metal. He approaches the horse again, this time moving even more slowly, more deliberately. He grabs the pommel of the saddle with both hands, places his left foot in the stirrup, and begins to hoist himself up. The motion is clumsy, lacking any grace or fluidity. William's right leg swings over the horse's back, but the mail shirt rides up, pinching his skin. He settles into the saddle with a barely audible grunt, and for a moment he simply sits there, catching his breath. This is his victory, not conquering enemies or rescuing damsels, but simply managing to get onto his horse without falling. Across the courtyard, another young knight named Thomas is practicing with his sword. The weapon is heavier than it looks, a double-edged blade that measures nearly 3 feet from hilt to tip. Thomas grips it with both hands, his knuckles white with the effort. His instructor has placed a wooden post in the ground, wrapped with straw and cloth to simulate an opponent. Thomas is supposed to strike this target with controlled, precise movements. But control is exactly what Thomas lacks. Each swing of the sword is either too weak or too strong. When he strikes too lightly, the blade barely cuts into the straw. When he puts all his strength behind the blow, the sword becomes unwieldy, pulling him off balance. His feet, encased in heavy leather boots with metal reinforcements, slip on the damp stones. More than once, Thomas has to plant the sword tip into the ground to keep himself from falling. The morning progresses slowly. Other young men join the practice, each struggling with their own set of difficulties. There's Geoffrey, who can barely see through the eye slits of his helmet. The metal piece sits awkwardly on his head, too large for his narrow face, and it shifts with every movement. He spends more time adjusting his helmet than actually training. There's Robert, whose hands shake slightly, not from fear, but from the simple strain of holding his shield for more than a few minutes. The wooden shield, reinforced with iron bands, feels like it weighs as much as a small child. These are not the knights of legend. These are young men from modest families, second sons who have been sent to learn the skills of warfare, not because they showed particular promise, but because their fathers could afford to send them, and because it was expected. They are earnest in their efforts, but their bodies and their equipment seem to conspire against them at every turn. Sir Edmund moves among them like a patient teacher, offering gentle corrections and quiet encouragement. He's been training knights for nearly 20 years, and he's learned that the greatest battles are often fought not against enemies, but against the simple challenge of mastering one's own equipment. He watches as William, still mounted on Rosalind, attempts to draw his sword while in the saddle. The motion, which should be fluid and natural, becomes a careful choreography of small movements. William must first adjust his position in the saddle, then reach across his body to grasp the sword's hilt. But the mail around his shoulders restricts his movement, and the sword's crossguard catches on the leather of his belt. He tugs gently, then more firmly, and finally the blade comes free, with a metallic scraping sound. He holds it up, not in triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of a small task completed. The training continues throughout the morning. The young knights practice mounting and dismounting, drawing and sheathing their weapons, walking in formation while wearing their armor. Each action that should be simple becomes complicated by the weight of metal, the restrictions of mail, and the simple fact that these young men are still learning to coordinate their movements. By midday, when the sun has burned through the morning mist, the courtyard is filled with the sounds of heavy breathing, the scrape of metal on stone, and the patient voice of Sir Edmund offering guidance. The young knights are exhausted, not from battle, but from the simple effort of wearing their equipment and attempting to move with some semblance of grace. This is the reality of knighthood that the troubadours rarely sing about, the long, slow process of learning to function while encased in metal, the daily struggle to master equipment that seems designed to hinder rather than help. These knights in training are not heroes yet, and some of them never will be, but they are learning something perhaps more valuable than heroism: persistence, patience, and the quiet courage to keep trying even when everything seems to work against you. As the afternoon approaches, the training session begins to wind down. The young men help each other out of their armor, the process almost as cumbersome as putting it on. They move slowly, carefully, their movements economical and deliberate. They've learned, through repetition and necessity, to conserve their energy, to move with purpose rather than haste. William finally dismounts from Rosalind, the process taking several minutes as he carefully lowers himself to the ground. His legs are shaky from the effort of maintaining his balance in the saddle, and he leans against the horse for a moment to steady himself. Thomas sheathes his sword with the same careful attention he's practiced all morning, making sure the blade slides smoothly into its scabbard without catching on anything. These moments of quiet accomplishment, successfully mounting a horse, properly drawing a weapon, walking across a courtyard without tripping, these are their victories. Small victories, perhaps, but victories nonetheless. They are learning that knighthood is not about grand gestures or dramatic battles, but about the patient mastery of countless small skills, the gradual development of strength and coordination, and the slow process of becoming comfortable with the tools of their trade. As the sun begins to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the young knights finally remove their armor completely. The relief is visible on their faces as they lift the heavy mail shirts over their heads, as they unbuckle their sword belts, as they pull off their boots. They are tired, sore, and probably a little discouraged, but they are also one day closer to becoming the knights they aspire to be. Sir Edmund watches them with a mixture of fondness and patience. He knows that some of these young men will indeed become skilled knights, while others will find their calling elsewhere. But all of them, he believes, will be better for having learned the discipline of persistence, the value of patience, and the importance of taking things one small step at a time. And just as these young knights found ways to cope with the weight of their armor and the challenge of their training in other times and places throughout history, people occupied themselves with other equally methodical tasks, tasks that required the same kind of patience, the same steady rhythm of repetition, the same quiet determination to master something that seemed impossibly difficult at first. The thread that connects all these stories is the simple human capacity to persist, to find meaning in routine, to discover a kind of peace in the slow mastery of small skills. Whether it's a young knight learning to mount his horse, or a craftsman perfecting an ancient technique, or a keeper maintaining a lonely vigil, these are the quiet moments that make up the fabric of history. Now, let's turn our attention to some of these other gentle pursuits, these other ways that people throughout the ages have found to fill their days with purpose and routine. In the city of Bruges, in the year 1623, there lived a candlemaker named Henrik, whose workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow house on Vollestraat. The building was old even then, its timber frame dark with age and weather, its windows small and thick with glass that distorted the view of the street outside. But Henrik didn't need much light from the windows, for his work began before dawn and continued long after sunset, guided by the warm glow of his own candles. Henrik's workshop was a study in methodical precision. Along one wall stood wooden shelves lined with earthenware pots, each containing different types of wax. There was beeswax, golden and sweet-smelling, collected from the hives that dotted the countryside around Bruges. There was tallow, rendered from beef fat, less expensive, but requiring more skill to work with properly. And there was a small supply of precious spermaceti, obtained from whaling ships that occasionally docked at the harbor, prized for its clean burn and bright flame. The process of making candles was a meditation in repetition. Henrik would begin each morning by preparing his wicks, cutting lengths of cotton cord and braiding them with practiced fingers. The thickness of the wick had to match the diameter of the candle perfectly. Too thin, and the flame would sputter and die. Too thick, and the candle would smoke and drip wastefully. He would measure each wick carefully, marking the cotton with small knots to ensure consistency. Next came the preparation of the wax. Henrik would place chunks of beeswax in a large copper pot suspended over a small fire. The wax had to be heated slowly, gradually, until it melted into a golden liquid that moved like honey. Too much heat would burn the wax, giving it an acrid smell and a dark color. Too little heat would leave it thick and difficult to work with. Henrik had been making candles for 37 years, and he could tell the temperature of the wax by the way it moved in the pot, by the subtle changes in its color and consistency. The actual process of making the candles was called dipping, and it required a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Henrik would tie several prepared wicks to a wooden rod, spacing them evenly so they wouldn't touch each other. Then he would dip the wicks into the molten wax, lift them out, and wait for the wax to cool and harden before dipping them again. Each dip added a thin layer of wax to the wick, building up the candle gradually, patiently. The first few dips barely coated the wick, leaving it looking like a piece of string that had been wetted with golden liquid. But as Henrik continued the process, dip, lift, wait, dip, lift, wait, the candles began to take shape. After 20 dips, they were as thick as a child's finger. After 50 dips, they had the proper circumference for household use. The finest candles, meant for churches or wealthy homes, might require 100 dips or more. Between each dip, Henrik would pause and examine his work. He would check that the wax was coating evenly, that no air bubbles had formed, that the candles were hanging straight and true. If he noticed any imperfection, he would carefully scrape it away with a small knife, smoothing the surface until it was perfect. This attention to detail was what set Henrik's candles apart from those of his competitors. Each candle was not just a source of light, but a small work of art. The workshop was filled with the gentle sounds of Henrik's craft, the soft pop and hiss of the melting wax, the quiet splash as the wicks entered the liquid, the faint scraping of his knife as he perfected each surface. Outside, the city of Bruges went about its business, merchants calling out their wares, horses' hooves clattering on cobblestones, church bells marking the hours. But inside Henrik's workshop, time moved differently, measured not by bells or clocks, but by the steady rhythm of creation. As the day progressed, Henrik's candles would hang in neat rows from wooden frames, cooling and hardening in the dim light of the workshop. He would work his way through dozens of candles, each one requiring the same careful attention, the same patient repetition of the dipping process. His hands moved with the unconscious grace of a long practice, dipping and lifting, examining and perfecting. By evening, when the last light of day faded from the small windows, Henrik would have completed perhaps 36 candles. Not a large number, but each one was perfect, smooth and straight, with a wick properly centered and a surface free from bubbles or irregularities. He would trim the wicks to the proper length, clean the wax strips from the bases, and arrange the finished candles in wooden boxes lined with soft cloth. Before closing his workshop for the night, Henrik would light one of his own candles and place it on his workbench. The flame would dance gently in the still air, casting warm light on the walls and shelves. He would sit for a few moments, watching the candle burn, listening to the tiny crackling sounds the flame made as it consumed the wax. This was his reward, not just the knowledge that he had created something useful, but the simple pleasure of watching his work fulfill its purpose. The candle would burn steadily, cleanly, without smoke or sputtering. The wax would melt evenly, forming a perfect pool around the wick. The flame would remain constant, neither too large nor too small, providing just the right amount of light for reading or working. This was the measure of Henrik's skill, not in the making of the candle, but in its burning. Each candle was a small promise kept, a guarantee of light and warmth in the darkness. As Henrik prepared to leave his workshop and climb the narrow stairs to his living quarters above, he would take one last look at his work, the rows of cooling candles, the neat arrangement of his tools, the carefully banked fire that would be rekindled tomorrow morning. All of it spoke to the quiet satisfaction of a craft practiced with patience and precision. Tomorrow he would begin again with the same careful attention to detail, the same steady rhythm of creation, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as people needed light to push back the darkness. On a rocky outcrop off the coast of Cornwall, in the year 1847, stood a lighthouse that had been guiding ships safely to harbor for nearly 2 centuries. The structure was built of local granite. Its stones fitted together so perfectly that even the fiercest storms could not penetrate its walls. Rising 80 feet above the churning waters below, the lighthouse was home to a man named Samuel Hartwell. who had tended its light for the past 14 years. Samuel's daily routine was as predictable as the tides that surrounded his isolated home. He would wake each morning at dawn, not to the sound of roosters or church bells, but to the endless rhythm of waves breaking against the rocks below. His first task was always the same: to climb the narrow spiral staircase that wound up through the center of the lighthouse to the lamp room at the top. The staircase was worn smooth by countless trips up and down, its stone steps polished by the passage of Samuel's boots and those of the lighthouse keepers who had come before him. Each step required careful attention, for the stairs were steep and narrow, and Samuel often carried supplies or equipment as he climbed. The journey to the top took him past small windows cut into the thick walls, each offering a different view of the sea and sky. At the top of the lighthouse, in the lamp room, stood the most important object in Samuel's world: the great lens that focused and magnified the light. This lens, imported from France at considerable expense, was a marvel of engineering. It stood nearly 6 feet tall and was composed of hundreds of individual pieces of glass, each cut and polished to precise specifications. The lens was designed to gather the light from a single flame and send it out across the water in a beam that could be seen for miles. Samuel's first task each morning was to inspect the lens carefully. He would examine every surface, looking for any trace of salt spray, dust, or condensation that might dim the light. Using a soft cloth and a mixture of vinegar and water, he would clean each piece of glass with methodical precision. The work was painstaking. Each section of the lens had to be cleaned separately, and Samuel had to be careful not to scratch or damage the delicate surfaces. The cleaning process could take up to 2 hours, depending on the weather conditions of the previous night. After storms, when salt spray had coated the lens heavily, Samuel might spend the entire morning restoring it to perfect clarity. He worked slowly, carefully, taking no shortcuts. The lives of sailors depended on the brightness of his light, and Samuel took this responsibility seriously. Once the lens was clean, Samuel would turn his attention to the lamp itself. The light source was a large oil flame, fed by a reservoir of whale oil that had to be filled regularly. Samuel would check the oil level, trim the wick to ensure an even flame, and adjust the position of the light to ensure it was perfectly centered in the lens. The flame had to burn at exactly the right intensity. Too dim, and ships might not see it in time. Too bright, and the oil would be consumed too quickly. The lighthouse burned oil constantly, day and night, consuming several gallons each week. Samuel had to keep careful records of his oil consumption, noting the weather conditions, the brightness of the flame, and any adjustments he made. This information was important for calculating future supplies and for ensuring that the lighthouse never ran out of fuel. After tending to the lamp, Samuel would make his way back down the stairs to attend to the other duties of his isolated life. He maintained a small garden on the one patch of level ground near the lighthouse, growing vegetables that could withstand the salt air and constant wind. The soil was poor, mostly sand and broken shell, but Samuel had learned to work with what nature provided. His garden was a study in patience and persistence. The plants grew slowly in the harsh conditions, and Samuel had to protect them from the worst of the weather with carefully constructed windbreaks made from driftwood and canvas. He would spend hours each day tending his vegetables, watering them with precious fresh water from his cistern, picking off insects by hand, and adjusting the protective barriers as the wind direction changed. Samuel's meals were simple affairs, usually consisting of vegetables from his garden, fish caught from the rocks below the lighthouse, and supplies brought by the supply boat that visited once a month. He cooked on a small stove in the lighthouse's kitchen, a cramped room carved out of the thick stone walls. The cooking was functional rather than elaborate. Samuel had learned to prepare nutritious meals with limited ingredients and cooking space. The afternoons were often spent in maintenance work. The lighthouse required constant attention. The metal parts needed to be cleaned and oiled to prevent rust. The stonework needed to be inspected for cracks or damage, and the stairs needed to be swept and maintained. Samuel had become skilled at basic carpentry, metalworking, and masonry out of necessity. When something broke or wore out, he usually had to fix it himself. As evening approached, Samuel would climb the stairs once more to prepare the light for the night. This was the most important time of his day, for it was after dark that ships most needed his guidance. He would relight the lamp if it had gone out, adjust the flame to its proper brightness, and begin the long night vigil that was the heart of his profession. Throughout the night, Samuel would climb the stairs every few hours to check on the light. He would look out across the dark water, watching for the lights of ships that might be struggling in the darkness. Sometimes he would see nothing but empty ocean and star-filled sky. Other times, especially during storms, he might spot the desperate signals of vessels in distress. On clear nights, Samuel could see for miles in every direction. The beam of his lighthouse swept across the water in a steady rhythm, a bright finger of light that proclaimed the presence of safe harbor. He would sometimes count the ships that passed in the night, noting their size and direction in the logbook he kept. Each entry was a small record of lives kept safe, of disasters prevented by the steady gleam of his light. During storms, Samuel's vigil took on added urgency. The wind would howl around the lighthouse, and rain would lash the windows with tremendous force. At such times, the lens might fog with condensation, requiring Samuel to climb the stairs repeatedly to clear it. The light might flicker or dim, requiring constant adjustment of the flame. And always, there was the knowledge that somewhere out in the darkness, sailors were fighting for their lives against the fury of the sea. Samuel had been keeping the light for 14 years, and in that time, he had seen countless ships pass safely through the treacherous waters around his lighthouse. He had also witnessed tragedies, ships that had foundered despite his best efforts, lives lost to the unforgiving sea. These experiences had taught him that his work was not just about maintaining equipment, but about providing a beacon of hope in the darkness, a promise that somewhere, someone was watching and waiting to help. As dawn approached each day, Samuel would make his final inspection of the light before allowing it to rest during the daylight hours. He would clean the lens one more time, record the night's observations in his log, and prepare for another day of quiet vigilance. The rhythm of his life was as constant as the tides, as reliable as the sunrise, and as essential as the light itself. Along the banks of the Nile River, in the year 1323 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, there lived a scribe named Kati who worked in the House of Life attached to the great temple of Karnak. Katie's workshop was a simple mud brick building with a flat roof and small windows positioned to catch the best light during the morning hours. The walls were whitewashed to reflect light, and the floor was covered with reed mats that could be easily swept clean. Katie's specialty was the preparation of papyrus, the writing material that was essential to the administration of the Egyptian kingdom. Every official document, every religious text, every letter of importance was written on papyrus that had been carefully prepared by scribes like Katie. The process was long and required great patience, but Katie had been doing this work for 23 years, ever since he had completed his education in the scribal school. The preparation of papyrus began with the papyrus plant itself, which grew abundantly in the marshes along the Nile. The plant could grow to heights of 15 feet or more, its thick stalks topped with feathery plumes that swayed in the river breeze. Katie would travel to the marshes several times each month, wading into the shallow water to select the finest stalks. He looked for plants that were mature, but not old, with stalks that were straight and free from damage. The cutting of the papyrus had to be done with care. Katie used a sharp bronze knife to slice through the stalks just above the waterline, making sure not to damage the root system so the plant could continue to grow. He would bundle the cut stalks and transport them back to his workshop on a small boat, the green stems lying neatly arranged in the bottom of the vessel. Back in his workshop, Katie would begin the actual preparation process. First, he would strip away the outer bark of the papyrus stalks, revealing the white pith inside. This pith was the heart of the papyrus plant, containing the fibers that would eventually become writing material. Katie worked with practiced movements, his knife sliding smoothly along the length of each stalk, removing the bark in long, continuous strips. Once the stalks were stripped, Katie would cut them into sections roughly 18 inches long. These sections were then sliced lengthwise into thin strips, each about half an inch wide. The cutting required a steady hand and sharp tools. If the strips were too thick, the finished papyrus would be rough and difficult to write on. If too thin, it would be fragile and likely to tear. The strips had to be cut from the center of the stalk, where the pith was most uniform and contained the highest concentration of natural resins. These resins would help bind the papyrus together when it dried. Katie would examine each strip carefully, discarding any that showed signs of damage or irregularity. Only the finest strips would be used for the highest quality papyrus. After cutting, the strips needed to be soaked in water from the Nile. Katie kept several large pottery vessels filled with river water for this purpose. The soaking served two purposes. It made the strips more pliable and easier to work with, and it allowed the natural sugars and resins in the plant to dissolve into the water, creating a natural adhesive that would help bind the finished papyrus together. The strips would soak for 3 days, during which time Katie would change the water daily to prevent spoilage. He would gently agitate the water with a wooden paddle, making sure that all the strips were evenly soaked. The timing was critical. Too little soaking would result in brittle papyrus that cracked easily, while too much soaking would cause the strips to become mushy and difficult to handle. After soaking came the most delicate part of the process, the laying out of the papyrus. Katie would work on a smooth wooden board, arranging the strips in 2 layers. The first layer was laid horizontally with each strip placed carefully alongside its neighbor, overlapping slightly to ensure there were no gaps. The strips had to be perfectly aligned, or the finished papyrus would be uneven and difficult to write on. The second layer was laid vertically, at right angles to the first layer. This cross-grain construction gave the papyrus its strength and prevented it from tearing easily. Katie would work slowly and methodically, placing each strip with precision. His hands moved gently but confidently, guided by years of experience in judging exactly how much overlap was needed and how tightly the strips should be placed together. Once both layers were in place, Katie would cover the papyrus with a clean linen cloth and place it under a heavy stone press. The pressing was crucial. It forced out excess water and pressed the strips together so tightly that the natural resins would bind them into a single sheet. The papyrus would remain under pressure for several days, during which time Katie would periodically check to make sure the pressing was proceeding evenly. While waiting for one batch of papyrus to dry under the press, Katie would begin preparing the next batch. His workshop usually contained papyrus in various stages of preparation, fresh stalks waiting to be stripped, strips soaking in water, sheets under the press, and finished papyrus drying in the sun. The process required careful timing and organization to ensure a steady supply of finished material. After pressing, the papyrus would be removed and laid out in the courtyard to dry in the Egyptian sun. The drying had to be done gradually. Too much direct sunlight would cause the papyrus to crack, while too little would allow mold to develop. Katie would move the sheets throughout the day, following the pattern of sun and shade to ensure even drying. The final step was the polishing. Once the papyrus was completely dry, Katie would smooth its surface using a piece of polished ivory or a smooth stone. This removed any rough fibers and created a surface that would accept ink cleanly without blotting or spreading. The polishing required a light touch and circular motions, working gradually across the entire surface of the sheet. When finished, each sheet of papyrus was a work of art in itself. The surface was smooth and creamy white, with the cross-hatched pattern of the underlying strips visible like a subtle watermark. The material was strong enough to last 4 centuries, yet flexible enough to be rolled into scrolls. It would accept ink beautifully, allowing scribes to create the documents that recorded the daily life of ancient Egypt. Katie would stack the finished papyrus carefully, placing sheets of linen between each layer to prevent them from sticking together. He kept detailed records of his production, noting the quality of each batch and the source of the papyrus plants. The finest sheets would be reserved for royal decrees and religious texts, while lesser quality papyrus would be used for everyday correspondence and administrative documents. At the end of each day, Katie would clean his tools and organize his workshop for the next day's work. The bronze knives would be sharpened and oiled to prevent rust. The pottery vessels would be refilled with fresh river water, and the workspace would be swept clean. Everything had its place, and maintaining this order was essential for the smooth operation of his craft. As the sun set over the Nile, casting long shadows across the temple complex, Katie would often sit quietly in his workshop, surrounded by the tools and materials of his trade. The work was repetitive, requiring patience and attention to detail. but it was also deeply satisfying. Each sheet of papyrus he created would carry words into the future, preserving knowledge and communication for generations to come. In his quiet way, Katie was helping to build the foundation of human civilization, one carefully prepared sheet at a time. In the small town of Vézelay, in Burgundy, in the year 1134, a stonemason named Pierre worked on the construction of the great basilica that would one day become a destination for pilgrims from across Europe. Pierre lived in a modest stone house just down the hill from the construction site, and each morning he would walk the short distance to work carrying his tools in a leather satchel worn smooth by years of use. Pierre's workday began before sunrise, when the air was cool and the light was soft. The early morning hours were precious to a stonemason, for the stone was easier to work when it hadn't been heated by the sun, and the cooler temperatures helped prevent his tools from becoming too hot to handle comfortably. He would arrive at the construction site while the town was still quiet, with only the sound of roosters and the distant bells of the abbey to mark the passage of time. His first task each morning was to examine the block of stone that had been assigned to him the previous day. The blocks were quarried from a site several miles away and transported to the construction site by ox-drawn carts. Each block was roughly cut at the quarry, but the fine shaping had to be done by hand, with tools and techniques that had been passed down through generations of stoneworkers. Pierre would run his hands over the surface of the stone, feeling for flaws or irregularities that might affect his work. Stone was a living material, full of hidden stresses and weaknesses that could cause a block to split unexpectedly if not handled properly. Pierre had learned to read stone like a scholar reads books, understanding the subtle signs that told him how the material would behave under his tools. The stone used for the basilica was a fine-grained limestone quarried from beds that had been formed millions of years ago, when this part of France lay beneath a warm, shallow sea. The limestone was relatively soft when first quarried, making it easier to carve, but it would harden with exposure to air, becoming more durable over time. This quality made it ideal for construction, but it also meant that Pierre had to work quickly once a block was delivered to him. Pierre's tools were simple, but perfectly suited to their purpose. His primary tool was a hammer, forged from iron and fitted with a wooden handle that had been shaped to fit his hand exactly. The hammer head was flat on one side for general shaping work and pointed on the other for more detailed carving. He also carried a selection of chisels, each one designed for a specific type of cut or texture. The technique of stone carving required a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Pierre would hold the chisel at precisely the right angle, then strike it with controlled blows from his hammer. Each blow had to be calculated. Too light, and the stone wouldn't yield. Too heavy, and it might crack or chip in unexpected ways. The sound of hammer on chisel on stone created a percussion that echoed throughout the construction site, a rhythm that varied with each craftsman's style and the type of work being done. Pierre's current assignment was to carve a series of capitals for the columns that would support the nave of the basilica. Each capital was a complex sculpture that would sit at the top of a column, providing both structural support and decorative beauty. The design had been provided by the master mason, but the actual carving was left to Pierre's skill and interpretation. The work proceeded slowly, deliberately. Pierre would begin by roughing out the basic shape of the capital, removing large chunks of stone to establish the general proportions. This rough work could be done relatively quickly, with bold strokes of hammer and chisel that sent chips of limestone flying. But as the carving progressed and the details became finer, Pierre's movements became more controlled, more precise. The capital Pierre was currently working on featured intertwined vines and leaves, a common motif in the religious architecture of the time. Each leaf had to be carved with careful attention to its relationship to the neighboring leaves, creating a sense of natural growth and movement. The vines wound around each other in complex patterns that required Pierre to visualize the finished design in 3 dimensions as he worked. The carving of fine details required different tools and techniques. For the delicate work of creating leaf veins and textures, Pierre used smaller chisels and worked with lighter hammer blows. Sometimes he would use only the pressure of his hands to guide the chisel, tapping it gently with a wooden mallet to avoid the harsh impact of the iron hammer. The finest details were carved with small picks and awls, tools that allowed him to work almost like a drawing with stone. As the morning progressed, the construction site filled with the sounds of productive labor. Other stonemasons worked nearby, each focused on their own assigned blocks. There were apprentices who mixed mortar and carried stones, carpenters who built the wooden scaffolding that supported the work, and laborers who moved materials around the site. But despite the bustle of activity, each craftsman worked within his own sphere of concentration, focused entirely on the task at hand. Pierre would pause periodically to step back and examine his work from different angles. Stone carving was unforgiving. Once material was removed, it couldn't be replaced. Every cut had to be carefully considered, and Pierre had learned to visualize each stage of the carving before he began cutting. He would run his fingers over the carved surfaces, feeling for rough spots or irregularities that needed to be smoothed away. The work was physically demanding. The constant hammering put strain on Pierre's arms and shoulders, and the fine detail work required him to maintain awkward positions for extended periods. Stone dust filled the air around his work area, coating his clothes and hair with a fine white powder. But Pierre had been doing this work since he was 14 years old, and his body had adapted to its demands. By midday, when the sun was directly overhead and the heat became uncomfortable, Pierre would pause for his main meal of the day. He would eat bread and cheese in the shade of the partially constructed walls, washing the stone dust from his throat with weak beer from an earthenware jug. This break also gave his tools a chance to cool down. Metal tools could become painfully hot when used continuously in the sun. The afternoon work proceeded more slowly than the morning session. The stone was harder to work when warm, and Pierre's hands and arms were beginning to feel the effects of the morning's labor. But this was also when he did his finest work, taking advantage of the excellent light to add the most delicate details to his carving. As the day drew to a close, Pierre would clean his work area and organize his tools for the next day. The chisels would be examined for damage and sharpened if necessary on a whetstone that he kept wrapped in oiled leather. The hammer handle would be checked for cracks or looseness, and all tools would be cleaned of stone dust and rubbed with a small amount of oil to prevent rust. Before leaving the construction site, Pierre would cover his work with wet cloths to keep the stone from drying out too quickly overnight. Rapid drying could cause cracking, especially in partially carved blocks where stresses had been created but not yet fully relieved. The careful protection of work in progress was just as important as the carving itself. As Pierre walked home through the narrow streets of Vigil, his body tired, but his mind satisfied, he carried with him the quiet pride of a craftsman who had spent the day creating something beautiful and permanent. The capital he was carving would outlast him by centuries, supporting the weight of the basilica and delighting the eyes of countless pilgrims who would come to worship in the sacred space he was helping to build. Each day's work was a small contribution to something much larger than himself, and this knowledge gave meaning to even the most tedious aspects of his craft. In the scriptorium of the Abbey of Saint Denis, just north of Paris, in the year 1211, a monk named Brother Aldrich spent his days bent over a writing desk, carefully copying and illuminating manuscripts that would preserve the knowledge of the ages. The scriptorium was a long, narrow room on the second floor of the monastery, with tall windows facing east to catch the best morning light. The walls were lined with wooden desks, each positioned to take advantage of the natural illumination, and the air was perpetually scented with the smell of parchment, ink, and the beeswax candles that supplemented the daylight during the darker months. Brother Aldrich had been a copyist for 19 years, ever since he had taken his vows and joined the community of monks at Saint Denis. He was particularly skilled at illumination, the art of decorating manuscripts with intricate drawings, elaborate initial letters, and borders filled with intertwining vines, fantastic creatures, and geometric patterns. His work was sought after by abbots and wealthy patrons throughout the region. But Brother Aldrich took no personal pride in this recognition. For him, each manuscript was an act of devotion, a way of serving God through the careful preservation and beautification of sacred texts. Brother Aldrich's current project was a psalter, a book containing the Psalms of David that would be used for daily prayers by the monks of the abbey. The text itself had already been copied by another monk whose specialty was pure calligraphy, and now it was Brother Aldrich's task to add the decorative elements that would make this particular psalter a work of art worthy of its sacred purpose. The process of illumination began long before Brother Aldrich touched brush to parchment. First, he had to prepare his materials, a task that could take days or even weeks, depending on the complexity of the work ahead. The parchment itself was made from sheepskin that had been carefully cleaned, stretched, and scraped until it was smooth and white. Each sheet had to be examined for flaws, holes, thin spots, or irregularities that might affect the final appearance of the manuscript. The inks and paints that Brother Aldrich used were made according to recipes that had been developed over centuries of monastic tradition. The basic black ink was made from oak galls, iron, and wine, mixed with gum arabic to give it the proper consistency. This ink would flow smoothly from the quill and would darken with age, becoming more permanent over time. But for illumination work, Brother Aldrich needed a full palette of colors each one prepared from specific materials and requiring different techniques. The preparation of gold leaf was perhaps the most delicate and expensive part of the process. Real gold was beaten into sheets so thin that they were almost transparent, then cut into small squares and stored between sheets of soft parchment. The application of gold leaf required perfect timing and conditions. The adhesive had to be exactly the right consistency. The air had to be still to prevent the delicate sheets from blowing away, and Brother Aldrich's hands had to be completely steady to avoid tearing the precious material. Red ink was made from cinnabar, a mineral that had to be ground into the finest possible powder and mixed with egg white and honey. The grinding process alone could take an entire day, as the cinnabar had to be reduced to particles so small that they were invisible to the naked eye. Blue came from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported at great expense from distant mountains. The process of extracting the blue pigment from the stone was complex and time-consuming, involving repeated grinding, washing, and filtering to separate the pure blue from the gray matrix rock. Green was created by mixing yellow and blue, but achieving the right shade required careful experimentation. Too much yellow, and the green would be garish and unnatural. Too much blue, and it would be dark and muddy. Brother Aldrich kept detailed notes on his color mixtures, recording the exact proportions that produced the most pleasing results. These notes were valuable knowledge that would be passed on to the next generation of illuminators. The actual work of illumination proceeded with painstaking slowness. Brother Aldrich would begin each day by examining the page he was working on, planning his approach and visualizing the finished design. The psalter he was currently illuminating featured large initial letters at the beginning of each psalm, surrounded by elaborate borders filled with vines, flowers, and small figures of angels and saints. The initial letter that Brother Aldrich was working on today was a B for Beatus Vir, the opening words of the first psalm. The letter itself was nearly 3 inches tall, and every surface would be covered with decoration. Brother Aldrich began by sketching the basic outline of the letter with a piece of charcoal, working lightly so that the marks could be erased if necessary. The proportions had to be perfect, as any distortion would be immediately apparent in the finished work. Once the outline was established, Brother Aldrich began the process of applying the gold leaf. This was always done first, as the gold had to be burnished to a high shine, and this burnishing process might disturb other colors if they were applied first. Brother Aldrich prepared the adhesive by mixing gum arabic with a small amount of honey and diluting it with water until it had the consistency of thin cream. This mixture was painted onto the areas that would receive the gold, using a fine brush made from squirrel hair. The timing of the gold application was critical. The adhesive had to be allowed to dry until it was tacky, but not completely dry, a state that Brother Aldrich judged by touching it lightly with his knuckle. When the adhesive reached the proper consistency, he would carefully place small pieces of gold leaf over the prepared areas, using a soft brush to smooth them down and ensure that they adhered properly. After the gold leaf was in place, Brother Aldrich would burnish it with a piece of polished agate mounted on a wooden handle. The burnishing process required gentle, circular motions that gradually brought the gold to a brilliant shine. Too much pressure would tear the delicate leaf, while too little would leave it dull and lackluster. The finished gold areas would gleam like tiny mirrors, catching and reflecting the light that fell on the manuscript. With the gold work completed, Brother Aldrich turned his attention to the other colors. Each color had to be applied with care, using brushes of different sizes depending on the area to be covered. The largest areas might be painted with brushes made from hog bristles, while the finest details required brushes made from single hairs taken from the tip of a squirrel's tail. The painting process required multiple layers of color to achieve the desired depth and richness. Brother Aldrich would apply a base coat first, allowing it to dry completely before adding additional layers for shading and highlighting. The drying time between coats could be several hours, especially in humid weather, so Brother Aldrich usually worked on several different sections of the manuscript simultaneously, moving from one area to another as the paint dried. The most challenging part of the illumination was the creation of the small figures that populated the borders and margins of the manuscript. These might include angels with delicately rendered wings, saints holding the symbols of their martyrdom, or fantastic creatures drawn from the medieval bestiary tradition. Each figure had to be drawn with perfect proportions and painted with colors that harmonized with the overall design of the page. Brother Aldrich worked with a magnifying glass made from a piece of polished crystal set in a wooden frame. This simple lens allowed him to see the finest details of his work and to paint with a precision that would have been impossible with the naked eye. The rendering of faces required particular skill. Each expression had to convey the appropriate spiritual emotion, whether it was the serene joy of an angel or the suffering acceptance of a martyr. The completion of a single illuminated page could take several weeks, depending on the complexity of the design. Brother Aldrich worked slowly and methodically, never rushing or taking shortcuts that might compromise the quality of the finished work. He understood that the manuscripts he created might last for centuries, carrying their sacred texts and beautiful decorations to generations of readers, yet unborn. As Brother Aldrich worked, the scriptorium around him was filled with the quiet sounds of scholarly labor. Other monks sat at their own desks, some copying texts, others binding finished manuscripts, still others preparing materials for future projects. The work was done in silence, in accordance with the monastic rule. But there was a sense of shared purpose that bound the community together in their common task. The completion of the Psalter would mark another milestone in Brother Aldrich's long career as an illuminator. When finished, the book would be a masterpiece of medieval art, its pages glowing with gold and brilliant colors, its texts preserved in the finest calligraphy, its binding crafted from the best leather and decorated with precious stones. But for Brother Aldrich, the true satisfaction lay not in the beauty of the finished product, but in the quiet hours spent in contemplation and creation, offering his skills in service to something greater than himself. As the light began to fade from the tall windows of the scriptorium, Brother Aldrich would carefully clean his brushes and cover his work to protect it from dust and moisture. Tomorrow, he would return to the same desk, take up the same tools, and continue the slow, meditative process of bringing beauty into the world, one careful brushstroke at a time. In this way, through countless small acts of devotion and skill, the knowledge and artistry of the medieval world was preserved and passed on to future generations. In the ancient city of Hangzhou, during the Song dynasty in the year 1127, there lived a tea master named Chen Wei, who had devoted his entire adult life to the understanding and preparation of tea. His modest house was situated in the hills above Westlake, surrounded by terraced gardens where tea bushes grew in neat rows, their leaves glistening with morning dew. Chen Wei had inherited this property from his father, who had been a tea master before him, and his grandfather before that, creating a lineage of tea, knowledge that stretched back over a century. Chen Wei's day began each morning before dawn, while the world was still wrapped in darkness and silence. He would rise from his simple wooden bed and dress in the plain robes of undyed hemp that marked him as a man who had chosen simplicity over ostentation. His movements were quiet and deliberate, for he had learned that the preparation of tea was not merely about the brewing of leaves and water, but about the cultivation of a particular state of mind, one of peace, attention, and reverence for the simple gifts of nature. The first task of each day was the gathering of water. Chen Wei would take a ceramic jar and walk down the hillside to a spring that bubbled up from the rocks near the lake shore. This spring had been known for centuries for the purity and sweetness of its water, and tea masters from across the region would sometimes travel great distances to collect water from this particular source. The water was crucial to the tea. Even the finest leaves would produce an inferior brew if prepared with water that was too hard, too soft, or tainted with impurities. Chen Wei would fill his jar slowly, allowing the water to flow naturally into the vessel without disturbing the sandy bottom of the spring. He believed that water gathered with haste or violence would retain some of that agitation and would never produce the perfect calm that good tea required. As he collected the water, he would often pause to watch the sun rise over the lake, observing the way the light gradually illuminated the mist that hung over the water's surface. Returning to his house, Chen Wei would begin the process of selecting the tea leaves for the day's first brewing. His storage room contained dozens of different teas, each one carefully preserved in sealed ceramic containers. Some were green teas, picked while the leaves were young and tender, then carefully heated to prevent fermentation. Others were oolong teas, partially fermented to create complex flavors that combined the freshness of green tea with the depth of black tea. Still others were aged teas, some of them decades old, their flavors mellowed and refined by time. The selection of tea was not made lightly. Chen Wei would consider the weather, the season, his own mood, and the particular qualities he wished to cultivate in himself through the drinking of tea. On cool, misty mornings like this one, he often chose a delicate green tea that had been picked from bushes growing at high altitude, where the cool air and frequent clouds produced leaves with a subtle sweetness and a clean, refreshing character. Chen Wei would examine the chosen leaves carefully, spreading a small amount on a white porcelain plate and studying their color, shape, and aroma. Good tea leaves should be uniform in size and color, with no signs of damage or decay. He would inhale the dry aroma of the leaves, noting the subtle hints of flowers, fruits, or vegetation that would become more pronounced when the leaves were steeped in hot water. The preparation of the water was as important as the selection of the leaves. Chen Wei would heat the spring water in a special kettle made of iron, monitoring the temperature with the careful attention of an alchemist. Different types of tea required different water temperatures. Green teas needed cooler water to preserve their delicate flavors, while black teas could tolerate much hotter water. The heating had to be done slowly and evenly, and Chen Wei would listen to the subtle changes in the sound of the water as it approached the proper temperature. The first sign was a gentle murmur, like distant conversation, as small bubbles began to form on the bottom of the kettle. This was followed by a stronger bubbling sound as the water became more agitated. Finally, there would be a moment of relative quiet just before the water reached a full boil. This was the moment Chen Wei was listening for, the perfect temperature for the green tea he had chosen. Chen Wei's teapot was a masterpiece of the potter's art, made from purple clay that had been mined from deposits near the city of Yixing. This particular clay was prized by tea masters because it was porous enough to absorb and retain the flavors of the tea, yet smooth enough to allow for easy cleaning. The teapot had been made specifically for Chen Wei by a master potter, and its proportions were perfectly calculated to bring out the best qualities of the teas he most often prepared. Before adding the tea leaves, Chen Wei would warm the teapot by rinsing it with hot water. This served two purposes. It ensured that the teapot would not cool the water too quickly when the tea was added, and it also prepared the clay to receive the tea, opening the pores that would absorb and enhance the flavors. The warming had to be done carefully, as sudden temperature changes could crack even the finest clay. The actual brewing of the tea was a process that required perfect timing and precise movements. Chen Wei would add the tea leaves to the warmed pot, then pour the hot water over them in a slow, steady stream. The water had to cover the leaves completely, but the pot should not be filled to the brim, as the leaves would expand as they steeped and could overflow the pot if there was insufficient room. The steeping time was critical and varied depending on the type of tea being prepared. For the delicate green tea Chen Wei had chosen this morning, the first infusion would be very brief, perhaps 30 seconds, just long enough to begin extracting the flavors from the leaves without drawing out too much of the tannins that could make the tea bitter. Subsequent infusions could be slightly longer, as the leaves would release their flavors more slowly after the initial steeping. While the tea steeped, Chen Wei would prepare his teacup, a small porcelain vessel that held no more than a few ounces of liquid. Like the teapot, the cup had been made specifically for him by a master craftsman, and its size and shape were designed to enhance the experience of drinking tea. The cup was small enough that the tea would not cool too quickly, yet large enough to allow the drinker to appreciate the tea's aroma as well as its flavor. When the steeping time was complete, Chen Wei would pour the tea through a small strainer into a serving pitcher, then from the pitcher into his cup. This process served to aerate the tea slightly and to ensure that no tea leaves found their way into the cup. The pouring had to be done smoothly and steadily, as rough handling could disturb the delicate balance of flavors that had been created during the steeping process. The first taste of tea was always a moment of quiet revelation for Chen Wei. He would hold the small cup in both hands, warming his fingers against the porcelain, and inhale the steam that rose from the pale green liquid. The aroma would tell him immediately whether the brewing had been successful, whether the water temperature had been correct, whether the steeping time had been appropriate, whether the tea leaves had been properly prepared. The actual drinking of the tea was done slowly, thoughtfully, with complete attention to the sensations it created. Chen Wei would take small sips, allowing the tea to coat his tongue and fill his mouth before swallowing. He would notice the initial flavors, the way they developed and changed as the tea warmed in his mouth, and the subtle aftertaste that lingered after swallowing. Good tea would reveal layer upon layer of flavor, each sip bringing new discoveries and deeper appreciation. Chen Wei would typically prepare 3 or 4 infusions from the same tea leaves, each one revealing different aspects of the tea's character. The first infusion might be light and delicate, highlighting the tea's most subtle qualities. The second infusion often showed the tea's fullest flavors, while the third and fourth infusions would gradually fade, showing the tea's structure and underlying character as the more volatile flavors dissipated. Between infusions, Chen Wei would often sit quietly in his small garden, watching the morning light play on the leaves of his tea bushes and listening to the sounds of the waking world around him. Birds would begin their morning songs, insects would stir in the grass, and occasionally he would hear the distant sound of a boat on the lake below. These moments of quiet observation were as much a part of the tea ceremony as the actual preparation and drinking of the tea itself. The ritual of morning tea was not merely about consuming a beverage, but about creating a space of tranquility and mindfulness in which to begin each day. Through the careful attention required for proper tea preparation, Chen Wei cultivated qualities of patience, precision, and awareness that would serve him throughout the day. The tea ceremony was a form of meditation, a way of connecting with the natural world and with the long tradition of tea masters who had come before him. As the morning progressed and the tea ceremony came to an end, Chen Wei would carefully clean his teapot and cup, preparing them for the next day's use. The tea leaves, having given up their essence to the water, would be composted and returned to the garden where they would nourish the soil that fed the tea bushes. In this way, the cycle of growth, harvest, preparation, and renewal continued, each day bringing its own small ritual of gratitude and appreciation for the simple gifts that nature provided to those who knew how to receive them with proper reverence and care. In the city of Augsburg, in the Holy Roman Empire, in the year 1545, there lived a clockmaker named Johannes Zimmermann, whose workshop occupied the ground floor of a 3-story building on Zwischendenbadern Street. The building was narrow and tall, typical of the merchant quarter, with thick walls that helped muffle the constant ticking, chiming, and striking of the many timepieces that filled Johannes's workspace. His shop was known throughout the German states for the precision and reliability of his clocks, and wealthy merchants and church officials would travel considerable distances to commission work from his skilled hands. Johannes had learned his craft from his father, who had learned it from his father before him, creating a family tradition that stretched back to the early days of mechanical timekeeping. The art of clockmaking required not only technical skill and mathematical precision, but also an almost mystical understanding of the nature of time itself. Johannes often reflected that he was not merely building machines, but creating devices that would measure and mark the passage of human life, counting out the seconds, minutes, and hours that made up the span of mortal existence. The workshop was a marvel of organization and precision. Every tool had its designated place. Every component was stored in carefully labeled drawers, and every surface was kept scrupulously clean. The main workbench was positioned beneath the largest window to take advantage of the natural light, and it was equipped with a variety of magnifying glasses and delicate instruments that allowed Johannes to work on the tiny gears and springs that were the heart of his timepieces. Johannes's current project was a table clock commissioned by the wealthy banker Hans Fugger, whose family had become one of the most powerful financial dynasties in Europe. The clock was to be not merely functional, but also a work of art that would demonstrate the Fugger family's wealth and sophistication. The case was being carved from ebony by a master woodworker, and it would eventually be decorated with silver inlay and small precious stones. But the true masterpiece was the movement itself, the complex mechanism that would drive the clock's hands and strike the hours. The heart of any mechanical clock was the escapement, the ingenious device that controlled the release of energy from the mainspring and regulated the movement of the hands. Johannes had spent weeks designing and refining the escapement for this particular clock, calculating the precise angles and proportions that would ensure accurate timekeeping. The escapement consisted of dozens of tiny parts, each one cut and shaped by hand to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Johannes began each day by examining the work he had completed the previous day, checking for any signs of wear or misalignment that might affect the clock's accuracy. He would test each component separately, listening to the sound it made and feeling its movement with his fingertips. Years of experience had taught him to detect the slightest irregularity in the way a gear turned or a spring compressed. His hands had become so sensitive that he could feel variations in surface texture that were invisible to the naked eye. The creation of each gear was a process that could take several days to complete. Johannes would begin with a disc of brass, carefully measuring and marking the positions where the teeth would be cut. The spacing had to be absolutely precise. Even a tiny error in the position of a single tooth could cause the entire mechanism to run incorrectly. He would use a dividing engine, a specialized tool that allowed him to mark the gear blank with mathematical precision, ensuring that the teeth would be evenly spaced around the circumference. The actual cutting of the gear teeth was done with a series of small files and saws, each stroke carefully controlled to remove exactly the right amount of metal. Johannes worked slowly and methodically, checking his progress frequently with calipers and measuring devices. The shape of each tooth was critical, too sharp, and it would wear quickly, too blunt, and it would not mesh properly with its neighboring gears. The depth of each tooth had to be consistent around the entire gear, and the angles had to be calculated to minimize friction while ensuring reliable engagement. As Johannes worked, the shop was filled with the gentle sounds of his craft. the rhythmic scraping of files on metal, the soft ticking of completed clocks marking the passage of time, and the occasional chime or strike as one of his timepieces announced the hour. These sounds created a symphony of temporal precision that served as the soundtrack to Johannes's working life. The assembly of the clock movement required the utmost care and patience. Each gear had to be positioned exactly right in relation to its neighbors, and the spacing between components had to be measured with extreme precision. Johannes would work with tweezers and small pliers, manipulating parts so tiny that they were difficult to see clearly even with magnification. A single slip of the hand could damage components that had taken days to create. The mainspring was perhaps the most critical component of the entire mechanism. This long, thin strip of tempered steel would store the energy that powered the clock, and its tension had to be calibrated perfectly. Too much tension, and the clock would run too fast, or the spring might break under the strain. Too little tension, and the clock would run slowly or stop altogether. Johannes had developed his own techniques for tempering and adjusting mainsprings, secrets that he guarded carefully and would pass on only to his own apprentices. The regulation of the clock's timekeeping was an art that required both technical knowledge and intuitive understanding. Johannes would adjust the length of the pendulum or the weight of the balance wheel by tiny increments, testing the clock's accuracy against a sundial or an established timepiece. He might make dozens of minute adjustments over the course of several days, gradually bringing the clock's rate closer and closer to perfect time. The final testing of a completed clock was a process that could take weeks. Johannes would allow the clock to run continuously, checking its accuracy multiple times each day and making note of any variations in its rate. He would test it in different positions to ensure that it kept accurate time regardless of how it was oriented. He would subject it to temperature variations and humidity changes to verify that it would continue to function reliably under normal household conditions. The satisfaction Johannes felt when a clock finally achieved perfect regulation was profound and lasting. Each timepiece he completed was not merely a machine, but a small triumph over the chaos and uncertainty of existence. In a world where so much was unpredictable and beyond human control, his clocks provided a reliable measure of time's passage, marking the hours and days with unwavering precision. The delivery of a completed clock to its owner was always a moment of pride for Johannes. He would personally transport the timepiece to its new home, carefully setting it up and explaining its operation to the customer. He would demonstrate how to wind the mainspring, how to adjust the hands if necessary, and how to maintain the clock to ensure its continued accuracy. Each clock came with Johannes's personal guarantee. If it failed to keep proper time, he would repair or replace it at no charge. As Johannes grew older and his eyesight began to fail, he took on apprentices who would carry on his tradition of precision and craftsmanship. He would teach them not just the technical aspects of clockmaking, but also the patience and dedication required to create timepieces that would serve faithfully for generations. The art of clockmaking was more than a trade. It was a calling that required complete devotion to the pursuit of perfection. In his workshop, filled with the gentle chorus of ticking clocks, Johannes had found his life's purpose. Each day brought its own challenges and discoveries. Each completed timepiece represented another small victory over the forces of entropy and decay. Through his clocks, Johannes was able to give structure and meaning to time itself, creating order from chaos and providing others with the gift of temporal precision. In a world where so much was transient and impermanent, his clocks would continue to mark the hours long after their maker had passed into history, silent testimony to the power of human skill and dedication. In the rolling hills of Tuscany, near the small town of San Gimignano, in the year 1398, there lived a woman named Margherita, who had devoted her life to the understanding and cultivation of medicinal herbs. Her modest stone cottage was surrounded by carefully tended gardens, where dozens of different plants grew in neat rows and carefully planned arrangements. Margherita had inherited both the cottage and the knowledge of herbs from her grandmother, who had been known throughout the region as a skilled healer and wise woman. Margherita's day began each morning with the first light of dawn, when the air was cool and filled with the concentrated fragrances of the plants that surrounded her home. This was the most important time for gathering herbs, for the morning dew helped to preserve the essential oils and active compounds that gave each plant its healing properties. Margherita had learned from her grandmother that herbs gathered at the wrong time of day or in the wrong season might be little more than a pleasant-smelling vegetation with no real medicinal value. The garden itself was a masterpiece of careful planning and patient cultivation. Each plant had been positioned according to its specific needs for sunlight, water, and soil conditions. The lavender grew on the sunny hillside where the soil drained quickly, while the comfrey flourished in the damper ground near the small stream that ran behind the cottage. The rosemary was planted near the kitchen, where it could be easily reached for cooking, but also where its strong fragrance would help to repel insects from the house. Margherita's knowledge of herbs encompassed not only their medicinal properties, but also the precise methods for harvesting, drying, and preparing them for use. Each plant had its own requirements and its own ideal time for gathering. The chamomile flowers had to be picked just as they reached full bloom, when their essential oils were at their peak concentration. The leaves of the mint plants were best gathered in the early morning before the sun became too strong, while the roots of the echinacea were most potent when dug in the fall after the plant had stored up its energy for the winter. On this particular morning, Margherita was planning to gather feverfew, a small plant with daisy-like flowers that was prized for its ability to reduce fever and ease headaches. The feverfew plants in her garden had been growing for 3 years, and they had reached the perfect maturity for harvesting. Margherita approached the plants with a sense of reverence and gratitude, for she understood that she was taking something precious that the earth had produced through months of patient growth. The actual gathering of the herbs was done with care and deliberation. Margherita used a sharp knife, made specifically for this purpose. Its blade kept clean and free from rust that might contaminate the plants. She would cut each stem cleanly, taking only what she needed and leaving enough of the plant to ensure its continued growth. The feverfew was cut just above a pair of healthy leaves, encouraging the plant to produce new growth from that point. As she worked, Margherita would examine each plant carefully, looking for signs of disease or insect damage that might affect the quality of the herb. Plants that showed any signs of problems were left untouched, for she had learned that healing herbs must themselves be healthy and vigorous. The selection process was as important as the gathering itself, requiring a trained eye and years of experience to distinguish between plants that would be truly beneficial and those that might be less effective. The feverfew was gathered into a shallow basket lined with clean linen cloth. Margarita was careful not to pack the herbs too tightly, as crushing could damage the delicate leaves and reduce their potency. Each piece was laid gently in the basket, positioned so that air could circulate freely around it. The morning's gathering would yield enough feverfew to supply her needs for several months, but the process could not be rushed or done carelessly. After completing the morning's harvest, Margarita would return to her cottage to begin the process of preparing the herbs for storage. The preparation methods varied depending on the type of plant and its intended use. Some herbs, like the feverfew, would be dried slowly in a warm, dark place until all moisture was removed and the leaves became crisp and aromatic. Others might be made into tinctures by soaking them in wine or vinegar to extract their active compounds. The drying of herbs was an art that required careful attention to temperature, humidity, and air circulation. Margarita had constructed special drying racks in the upper room of her cottage, where herbs could be spread out on screens made of woven reeds. The room had small windows that could be opened or closed to control the airflow, and the temperature was regulated by the heat that rose from the main room below. Each type of herb required different drying conditions. Delicate flowers like chamomile had to be dried quickly at low temperatures to preserve their color and fragrance. Thick leaves like comfrey needed more time and slightly higher temperatures to remove all the moisture. Roots and bark required the longest drying time of all, sometimes taking several weeks to reach the proper consistency. Margarita would check on the drying herbs several times each day, turning them gently to ensure even drying and watching for any signs of mold or decay that might spoil the entire batch. The herbs were ready when they were completely dry, but still retained their color and fragrance. Over-dried herbs would crumble to dust, while under-dried herbs would quickly develop mold when stored. Once properly dried, the herbs were stored in ceramic jars with tight-fitting lids. Each jar carefully labeled with the name of the herb and the date it was gathered. Margarita kept detailed records of her herb inventory, noting which plants had been most potent in different years and which growing conditions had produced the best results. This information was invaluable for planning future plantings and for ensuring a consistent supply of high-quality medicinal herbs. The preparation of herbal remedies was done according to recipes that had been passed down through generations of healers. Margarita had learned these formulations from her grandmother, who had learned them from her grandmother before her, creating an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back centuries. Each recipe was specific not only about which herbs to use, but also about the proportions, the method of preparation, and the proper way to administer the finished remedy. A typical remedy might combine several different herbs, each chosen for its specific properties and its ability to work in harmony with the others. A preparation for digestive troubles might include peppermint for its soothing properties, fennel for its ability to reduce gas and bloating, and chamomile for its gentle calming effect. The herbs would be carefully measured and combined, then prepared as a tea, a tincture, or a poultice, depending on the intended use. Margarita's reputation as a healer had spread throughout the surrounding countryside, and people would travel considerable distances to seek her help for various ailments. She would listen carefully to each person's symptoms, asking detailed questions about their diet, their daily habits, and their general health. Based on this information, she would select the appropriate herbs and prepare customized remedies designed to address each individual's specific needs. The healing practice was not just about the herbs themselves, but also about the relationship between the healer and the patient. Margarita understood that the act of caring, of taking time to listen and to offer help, was itself a form of medicine. She would spend considerable time with each person who came to her, offering not just herbal remedies, but also practical advice about diet, rest, and lifestyle changes that might improve their health. As the years passed, Margarita had accumulated a vast store of knowledge about the healing properties of plants and the art of herbal medicine. She had learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated which remedies would be most effective for different conditions, and she had developed her own variations on traditional recipes based on her observations and experience. The work was never truly finished, for there was always more to learn about the complex relationships between plants, human health, and the natural world. Each season brought new opportunities to observe and experiment, to test different growing methods, and to refine her understanding of how to best prepare and use the gifts that nature provided. In the quiet of her cottage, surrounded by the gentle fragrances of drying herbs and the soft sounds of the countryside, Margarita had found her calling. Through her careful cultivation and preparation of medicinal plants, she was able to offer comfort and healing to those who suffered, carrying on an ancient tradition of knowledge and compassion that connected her to countless generations of healers who had come before her. Each herb she gathered, each remedy she prepared, was an act of service to her community and a testament to the enduring power of natural healing. And so, we come to the end of our gentle journey through time, having walked alongside these quiet craftsmen and dedicated souls who filled their days with purpose, patience, and the steady rhythm of meaningful work. From the struggling knights in their training courtyard to the herbalist gathering morning dew with her feverfew, we have witnessed the common thread that binds all human endeavor, the simple act of persisting, of showing up each day to practice one's craft with care and attention. These were not the grand figures of history, not the kings and conquerors whose names echo through the centuries in bold letters. These were the people who made up the vast, quiet majority of human experience, the individuals who found meaning in small tasks repeated with devotion, who discovered purpose in the patient mastery of skills that served their communities, who understood that life's greatest satisfaction often comes not from dramatic achievements, but from the steady accumulation of well-done work. Think of young William, struggling to mount his horse in that misty courtyard, his mail shirt catching and pinching with every movement. His victory was not in defeating enemies or winning glory, but in the simple accomplishment of learning to coordinate his movements while wearing 60 pounds of metal. Each day, he returned to the courtyard. Each day, he faced the same challenges, and each day, he grew slightly more skilled, slightly more confident. His progress was measured not in grand leaps, but in small increments: a smoother mounting, a cleaner draw of his sword, a more balanced seat in the saddle. Consider Henrik in his candlemaker's workshop, dipping wicks into molten wax with the patience of a monk at prayer. Each candle required dozens of dips. Each dip had to be perfectly timed, and each finished candle was a small promise of light in the darkness. Henrik's work would never make him famous, would never be remembered in the history books, but every evening throughout his city, his candles pushed back the night and allowed families to gather, students to read, and workers to continue their tasks after sunset. His contribution to human happiness was immeasurable, yet it was achieved through the humblest of means. Remember Samuel in his lighthouse, climbing the spiral stairs night after night to tend his beacon. His vigil was solitary, his lighthouse isolated from the bustle of human society, yet his light guided countless ships to safety and saved innumerable lives. The sailors who saw his beacon cutting through the darkness may never have known his name, but they owed their safe passage to his unwavering dedication to his duty. In the loneliness of his tower, Samuel found purpose in service to strangers he would never meet. Think of Katie by the banks of the Nile, carefully preparing papyrus with the same techniques his ancestors had used for generations. The sheets he created would carry the words that preserved the knowledge and culture of his civilization. Every official decree, every religious text, every letter of love or business was written on papyrus that had passed through his patient hands. In his quiet workshop, Katie was helping to build the foundation of human communication and learning. Picture Pierre with his hammer and chisel, slowly carving beauty from blocks of stone. Each capital he completed would support the weight of the basilica for centuries to come, and each carved leaf and vine would delight the eyes of pilgrims for generations. His work was both functional and beautiful, serving the practical need for structural support, while also feeding the human hunger for artistic expression. In the rhythm of his hammer blows, Pierre was participating in humanity's eternal effort to create something lasting and meaningful. Envision Brother Aldrich bent over his manuscripts, applying gold leaf with the precision of a surgeon and the devotion of a saint. Each illuminated page was a prayer made visible, a celebration of divine beauty expressed through human skill. The manuscripts he created would preserve sacred knowledge for centuries, their brilliant colors and intricate designs inspiring countless readers to contemplation and wonder. Through his patient brushwork, Brother Aldrich was serving both God and humanity. Recall Chen Wei in his mountain retreat, preparing tea with the mindfulness of a meditation master. Each morning's ritual was a small ceremony of gratitude and awareness, a way of beginning the day with proper attention to the gifts of nature and the present moment. Through the careful preparation of tea, Chen Wei was cultivating not just flavor and aroma, but also the spiritual qualities of patience, mindfulness, and appreciation for simple pleasures. Remember Johannes in his clockmaker's workshop, creating timepieces with mathematical precision and artistic sensibility. Each clock he completed was a triumph over chaos and uncertainty, a machine that would reliably mark the passage of time for generations of users. In a world where so much was unpredictable, his clocks provided the gift of temporal order, allowing people to coordinate their activities and make the most of their limited time on Earth. And think of Margarita in her herb garden, gathering plants with the reverence of a priestess and the knowledge of a scientist. Each remedy she prepared was an act of healing and compassion, a way of alleviating suffering and promoting health in her community. Through her understanding of the medicinal properties of plants, Margarita was participating in humanity's ancient effort to work with nature rather than against it, to find healing and harmony in the world around us. What connects all these individuals across the centuries is their shared understanding that meaning comes not from grand gestures or dramatic events, but from the daily practice of doing one's work with care, attention, and devotion. They found purpose in routine, satisfaction in repetition, and joy in the gradual mastery of their chosen crafts. They understood that the great affairs of the world, the wars and politics, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the dramatic events that fill the history books, are built upon the foundation of countless small actions performed with skill and dedication. Their lives remind us that there is dignity in all honest work, beauty in all sincere effort, and value in all activities that serve the needs of others. Whether we are struggling to learn a new skill, practicing an ancient craft, or simply going about the daily business of living, we are participating in the great human tradition of finding meaning through purposeful action. The routines and processes we have explored tonight, the dipping of candles, the carving of stone, the preparation of manuscripts, the gathering of herbs, these are the quiet threads that weave together to form the vast tapestry of human civilization. Each individual thread may seem insignificant, but together they create something beautiful, complex, and enduring. In our modern world, where change happens rapidly and attention spans are short, there is something deeply comforting about these stories of patient persistence. They remind us that the most important things in life often develop slowly, that mastery comes through repetition rather than inspiration, and that the greatest satisfaction often comes from doing simple things well rather than complex things poorly. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps you can carry with you some of the calm persistence of these historical figures. Like William learning to mount his horse, you can approach tomorrow's challenges with patience and determination. Like Henrik dipping his candles, you can find meaning in the repetitive tasks that make up your daily life. Like Samuel tending his lighthouse, you can take satisfaction in faithfully performing duties that serve others, even when your efforts go unrecognized. Like Katie preparing his papyrus, you can see your work as a contribution to something larger than yourself. Like Pierre carving his stone, you can approach your tasks with both precision and artistry. Like Brother Aldrich illuminating his manuscripts, you can bring dedication and beauty to whatever you create. Like Chen Wei preparing his tea, you can find moments of mindfulness and gratitude in the simplest activities. Like Johannes crafting his clocks, you can seek to bring order and reliability to the world around you. And like Margarita gathering her herbs, you can look for ways to heal and help others through the knowledge and skills you possess. The fire in our imaginary hearth continues to crackle softly, its gentle warmth and rhythmic sounds providing a peaceful backdrop to our closing thoughts. In this quiet space, away from the urgency and noise of daily life, we can reflect on the value of slow, careful work and the satisfaction that comes from doing things well rather than doing them quickly. The stories we have shared tonight are a reminder that history is not just about the famous and the powerful, but about the countless, ordinary people who have lived lives of quiet purpose and gentle dedication. Their example teaches us that we don't need to change the world to lead a meaningful life. We need only to find our own small corner of creation and tend it with love and skill. As these gentle tales from the past settle into your mind like soft snow on a winter landscape, may they bring you the peace that comes from understanding that your own efforts, however humble they may seem, are part of the great human story of persistence, creativity, and hope. May the rhythm of the craftsman's hammer, the patience of the herbalist's gathering, and the devotion of the scribe's illumination remind you that there is profound beauty in the simple act of showing up each day to do your work with care. May these stories from long ago and far away bring you comfort in the present moment, and may the gentle sounds of history's quiet workers lull you into the deep, restorative sleep that prepares you for tomorrow's own opportunities to practice patience, skill, and loving attention to the tasks that await you. Sleep well, dear listener. Rest in the knowledge that you are part of a great tradition of human beings who have found meaning and purpose in the careful practice of their chosen work. Dream of misty courtyards and candlelit workshops, of scriptoriums and herb gardens, of lighthouse beacons and tea ceremonies, and know that in your own life, you too are weaving your thread into the great tapestry of human experience. Sweet dreams.